The holiday season is here. It is the fullest time of the year in all the ways. And today we are going to talk about how to handle one of the hardest parts of the holidays, grief, with grief therapist Litsa Williams.
So glad to get your email wanting to talk about this subject of, grief at the holidays, because I think it's just so important. So I'm really glad to be back.
Welcome to How the Wise One Grows, where we get curious and creative as we explore the things that help us grow together. I'm Holly, your host, a creative at heart, a yoga and mindfulness educator, and a fellow human and friend, exploring how we grow and can live our most authentic lives. I know it's weird, but one of my favorite things to talk about is grief. Litsa Williams, co-founder of What's Your Grief, first opened up my perspective on grief a couple of years ago when we spoke on this podcast in episode 43 about understanding grief. And with the holiday season upon us, I knew that I needed to get Litsa back to talk to us on the podcast about how we can deal with grief during the holidays. Litsa is a grief therapist and co-founder of the online community What's Your Grief. She's been interviewed as a grief expert for the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, NPR, and the New York Times, and she's here with us today. In this episode, we talk about why grief is so challenging during the holidays, how to go against the cookie-cutter holiday template and honor what feels right for you, and how to prep yourself for the holidays and communicate with others what you need during this time of year after loss. And we also talk about 3 pillars that you can turn to help you move through grief during the holiday season. I also want to note that this episode was recorded with Litsa months before the US election. And I just want to name that I think many of us, including myself, are experiencing a kind of post-election grief. And while this episode doesn't talk specifically about that, I think there are nuggets in this episode and conversation that can be helpful. Before we dive into today's conversation and into the holiday season, let's take a moment to land here together with a deep breath. So notice where your body makes contact with the earth. Let your spine lengthen and your shoulders soften down the back. And take a big breath in, fill your chest, fill your belly with air. And exhale, open your mouth, let it all out. All right, buckle up. This episode is your safety belt going into the holiday season. When people ask me what's my favorite podcast episode, I have a very hard time answering, but yours always comes up as one of the most transformational ones for me, because grief is this thing that all of us experience, and we don't often communicate around it in daily life, but it's here all of the time. So having that episode just, I think, provides such a strong foundation for all of us to deal with this very real part of life that doesn't get enough attention.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm biased, but I completely agree. I think all the time about, Ken Doka always says change equals loss equals grief. And life is just change. We're always changing and evolving, and even positive change in life can bring loss. And then, of course, just all of the other types of losses. And so it's everywhere. I think once you have experienced a significant loss and you start looking at the world through this lens of grief, it can be staggering how it's just everywhere. And yet there isn't, I mean, there is cultural conversation about it more than probably when I first got into this work, but certainly not as much as I think we could all benefit from.
Yeah. And I really love that framing of relating loss and change as grief, because something we talked about in that episode 43 was how you can experience loss and grief for things that isn't human life, that isn't, it can be loss of like a life you thought you were going to have, or even, when I was getting married, I had marriage described, and like the marriage ceremony described as almost like a funeral of your like maiden life into this like next chapter you're stepping into. And it's something that does come up in so many chapters, including, obviously the ones of loss of loved ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think being able to just name it is such an important part of validating and normalizing what we're feeling when it's there. So
Mm-hmm.
I just even that I think is so important and helpful for this conversation, like seeing all the places that we may be feeling it.
Yeah. So this is something I've been sitting with a lot lately. I feel like, I don't know if it's that people intuitively know it, but it's just kind of just like understood on some level that the holidays make grief feel extra hard. Like, I think when we're growing up, we see holidays as this beautiful, magical, joyful all the time of year. And as we get older, it becomes more complicated. And especially when we've lost a loved one, it can be really hard. That holiday season can just be really intense sometimes, or maybe all the time. But I was wondering, like, why are the holidays so hard when you're grieving?
Yeah, I think the way you introduced that, it really highlights some of the reasons that it is so
Mm-hmm.
hard. I mean, I think part of it is that going all the way back to childhood, we have really specific memories of the holidays. Like, if I asked you where you were on September 18th last year, unless that's a really meaningful day to you, like you probably have no idea. But if I ask you where you were on Thanksgiving last year, or even many of the Thanksgivings in your childhood, you'd
Mm-hmm.
possibly be able to identify that. If I ask about, with certain other significant holidays, it just is something that we have these clear memories of where we often are, who is there, what it's supposed to be like. And some of
Yeah.
those ideas develop from our childhood and early memories of holidays. And some are obviously from what we see in the media and all the narratives around what we're supposed to feel, especially at the winter holidays, right? Of, that we're supposed to have this idea of family and community. And so when any of that gets disrupted, we're so acutely aware of the absence, like where we feel it so dramatically. And oftentimes it's not just that there's a person who's missing, it's that along with that, traditions have had to change, the
Mm-hmm.
roles people fill are different, where we go. It may be that as the years pass, we're more and more aware of how many different people we've lost who are no longer at that holiday table or part of the day. So I think that that acute awareness of change at the holidays is one big piece of it. But the other is, I think sometimes we feel outside. Like you said, the holiday season is supposed to be joyful and happy and full of sparkles and meals and, all of these
Mm-hmm.
things. And it can feel like, oh, wow, everyone out here is savoring the holiday season and enjoying it and together with family. And I'm sort of outside of that because I'm struggling or I'm really feeling a lot of pain this holiday season and just I'm feeling disconnected instead of connected. So I think that is another piece, is that we almost feel like outsiders in the holiday season sometimes if grief feels really intense.
Mm-hmm. I think that so much of what you said is so important here, because I think in general and overall, society has this underlying tone of like, grin and bear it, put on a happy face, you should be positive, you should focus on the good and only bring attention to that. And while there is a time and space for those things, when we deny and don't make space for like what we're really feeling, the hard things as much as the good, we aren't tapping into our fullness and the totality of our human experience. And just like you were saying, like when we don't tap into that, when there's a part of us that isn't getting attention and isn't getting voice, it kind of feels like that outsiderness, that otherness, or like something is wrong because you like quote unquote should be feeling this other way. And the holidays, all of the language, all of the music, all of the stuff around it really, really heightens that. And I think even beyond, like, you know, even before you may have experienced loss, I feel like there's a lot of kids who grow up and are like feeling really heavy during the holidays because their family dynamics aren't the way that they think it should be, or different things happen on the holidays and everyone isn't always happy. And there is financial stress, there's emotional stress, there's all of this stuff going on that doesn't get space, doesn't get voice, and instead we're like pushed down the rhetoric of like joy, joy, most wonderful time of the year, like stuffing cookies down your face. It's like stuffing joy down your face when you're like, actually maybe I'm full, or like maybe I want like a carrot. Something different here. Mm-hmm.
Something that looks completely different than what this template, this cookie cutter template of what it's supposed to be, looks and feels like. I absolutely think that is a huge part of it for people. And there can be, I think, an obligation people feel also to find that holiday cheer or holiday spirit because of other people, whether that's children in their life or other family members. It's like not wanting to be the Debbie Downer or feeling like it's my role and responsibility to make sure everybody else has a really nice holiday. And I can't let people see how much I'm struggling. And that's, I think, when we look at the idea of family, we want to, I think, be able to be authentic with family and share that it's maybe messy and complicated and that we have so many mixed feelings about the holidays, but there can be a hesitation because it feels like, do other people have space for that? Are they going to have room for me to authentically share this range of experience I'm having about the holidays?
Yeah, and it feels kind of like a particularly intense and maybe like unwelcoming time to share what you're really feeling. Sometimes because there's that connotation of like we should be happy, and if you're not feeling happy, you're like, oh, it's the holidays, I shouldn't bring up this hard thing or have this big conversation right now. I should just be leaning into these other things and we can deal with that later if we need to. But then that kind of like cloud of doom is over your head, or that feeling is in the background. But you brought up children in that. And I think back of like my childhood, I feel like typically the primary caretaker for me, it was my mom, like just made things so magical and over the top as a kid, and like put all this, tons of pressure on herself. She would like stay up all night wrapping presents, but she would make it decorated and just look so over the top, and like the childlike joy and excitement, that real sense of magic I felt was so incredible. And I remember when it really started to shift and I could start to wake up to the other elements that were there. And as, you know, family dynamics change and deaths happen, and, you know, I've really shifted with how I feel at the holidays. But I often kind of go back and forth of like, if we talked about it differently from the beginning, would that shift be so hard? If we approached kids with like, here is magic and also here is reality side by side, one and one both can exist, what might that be like? Like, what do you think about the way we communicate with kids around the holidays?
Yeah, I think that you're exactly right. I think that there is this real, not for all kids, but for some kids, this real singular idea about this perfect magical holiday that sometimes adults worked very hard to try to always maintain the illusion that there was nothing difficult or nothing complex. And I think we carry the messages about that into adulthood, and it creates
Mm-hmm.
pressure on us to keep trying to replicate that, when I do think that in a lot of ways there may be a middle ground of
Mm-hmm.
being able to have space for things more authentically, even with kids, of being
Mm-hmm.
able to label some of the things that are hard and that are complicated, and that doesn't have to take away from appreciating the wonderful things and the things that
Mm-hmm.
really are beautiful and magical and that we feel grateful for, and also being able to acknowledge that there may be things that we're feeling a lot of other feelings about. And because the
Mm-hmm.
reality is, like, for reasons not related to grief, plenty of people, plenty of kids are disappointed when they don't have the gifts
Mm-hmm.
that they wanted on Christmas morning because of financial reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And when, we're not able to see everyone we wanted to because of family conflict and
Mm-hmm.
all of the things that sometimes come up. And so I think that having a more realistic idea about that as a child can lift some of the pressure that we then carry
Mm-hmm.
into adulthood, to feel like that's the ideal, is this kind of perfectly magical
Mm-hmm.
day that always runs seamlessly, this season where everything is perfect, and instead being
Mm-hmm.
able to say, like, oh no, it's life, it's always complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always full. And I feel like as adults, we need to kind of learn how to reparent ourselves and unlearn that stuff that was, just so like put in on us as children, for good intentions. But the more that we can get okay with the fullness of what we're feeling with a holiday, the better we can communicate it to kids in a way that's like okay, like yay, like we're feeling this happy thing, and like right now, like I'm feeling kind of low, so I'm just gonna make some space from that for that, and I'm gonna go on a walk. If there's anything that you're feeling low about, you can like join me on that, or we can, but we have to be okay with it within ourselves first, rather than kind of then further projecting like frustrations and falsehoods on them.
Yeah, and I think another way we can do that, that actually serves us really well in grief and in just with the reality that life is always changing, is really grounding what the values are behind the
Mm,
holidays. Like, what is it that we as a family value about this day or about this time of year? And knowing, when we know sort of what our why is,
mm-hmm.
the what and the how can change. Like, it's not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily always going to look exactly the same, because who's there and how we celebrate and what tradition looks like, there's going to be things that ebb and flow.
One of the most fun gifts I've given myself this holiday season is a subscription to Nuuly. Nuuly is an online clothing subscription service where you get to pick 6 items of clothing a month. They're shipped to you, they're packed sustainably, you get to wear them, get tons of compliments, and look cute all month long, and then send them back. It is so fun, and I feel like it's like having a personal shopper curate your clothing, because all of the clothes on the site are so cute. And also, once you sign up for a subscription, you get access to their thrifted section, where you get clothes that have been pre-worn and used and are now ready for sale for super cheap. I am obsessed with it, and I started it because a friend gave me their discount code, and I'm going to share a discount code with you today. So you can get $30 off your first Newly subscription by clicking the link in the show notes. I'm having so much fun with it this holiday season, and I want you to look really cute and feel fun too. You, listeners on the other end of this podcast, make it possible. And you can support the podcast and help it grow by leaving a review, rating, and preferably giving it a 5-star review on your favorite platform, and sharing an episode you love with a friend. Doing these things is like talking to the algorithm gods and helps other people find the podcast. And it really makes a big difference. So take a moment, pause, rate, review, and share this podcast. You can also really support this podcast and connect with listeners by following at How the Wise One Grows and following me at Holly's Azure on social media, particularly on Instagram. This is where we continue the conversations we have on the podcast. And I also put a lot of calls for listener submissions. So if you want to be on the podcast, be sure to follow us on Instagram. Another incredible thing you can do to support the podcast is to join the Dream Team and make my podcast dreams come true. You can join the Dream Team for as little as $3 a month, and this supports the operating costs and all the love, labor, and yes, sometimes tears that go into producing these episodes. There's a link in the show notes to join there as well. I'm also really excited to share that I have a few spaces available for one-on-one mentorship and coaching. During these sessions, we work together using the modalities of mindfulness, movement, and creative practices to support your mental, physical, and creative well-being and growth. This is one of my favorite things that I get to do, and I would be absolutely honored to work with you. And if you want a little more Holly in your life, but mentorship or coaching doesn't feel like the right fit, I also offer custom meditations that you can gift to yourself or a loved one, which is a great thing to do during the holiday season. All of the links are in the show notes as well. Now that's enough updates, and let's get back into the episode. So thank you so much for explaining a bit about why the holidays are particularly hard when we're grieving. I wanted to know if there are any grief myths about the holidays. I think sometimes there can be these just myths that are in our mind that can make things harder, easier. I don't know, what are some myths? What are things that can be helpful to debunk as we move into the holiday season?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the things that is hard about this is that sometimes maybe it's just individual myths. I don't know how generalized they are, because what we'll hear sometimes is some people saying, I know that it's going to be so much harder if we don't try to keep everything exactly the same. What we should be doing is trying to keep all the traditions, and everyone's going to be upset or devastated if we do anything differently. So we should do it exactly the same. And then, of course, you have other people who are like, I'm skipping the whole holiday altogether. If I even try to engage in the holiday, it's just going to be awful. I'm checking out this year. Maybe I'll be back next year for the holiday. And so I do think sometimes those extremes, people are often feeling like I have to do one or the other. I have to either try to make it as close to what it's always been as I can, or I need to do it completely differently. And the reality is that it varies for everyone. Some people skip the holiday or do something totally different. They're like, I went to a tropical island and pretended it wasn't happening, and it was glorious, and it was exactly what I needed. And other people are like, I went away and pretended it wasn't happening, and it was so much worse, and it was devastating, and I shouldn't have done it. I should have tried to be with people. There's no right or wrong, right? There's just what we do and how we cope with it. And I will say that one thing to consider, if you're in that place of feeling like we have to keep all the traditions the same, we have to do it for the kids. Sometimes that's a big thing we hear, we have to do it identically, is sometimes that effort to maintain everything as it was just ends up causing a stark contrast or relief from the reality that like that person is missing.
Yeah.
And sometimes that feels even heavier and more pronounced when you're working so hard to act like that isn't happening, and
Yeah.
act like that's not true. And sometimes it's really important to just be able to acknowledge some things are going to change and some things are going to stay the same. And some moments are going to be happy and some moments are going to be so incredibly sad and hard. And we're going to get through it, and we can make thoughtful, conscious decisions about how we do that. But
Mhm.
it doesn't have to mirror the way it's always been in order to still be a good, meaningful holiday, even with grief as part
Mhm.
of the holiday. And so I think having that flexibility is really important, and not feeling like tradition is something that if we let it go or let it flex or change it even for a year, that somehow it is going to disrupt and devastate the holiday for everyone. So I think that's the big one that pops to mind for me.
Yeah, I think that's so helpful in like even if you try to replicate the same holiday you've had, it is going to be different. I mean,
Yeah.
with or without loss, every year is going to be different. So, knowing that going into it at least can be like, maybe we move through the same mold and template, but I have to know that it's going to feel a lot different. And when it does, like, here's something I can do that helps. Like, I know my mother, we had a lot of recent loss with my parents and their parents, and my mom got like an ornament for the tree for each person that was lost
Yes.
that year. Just like a little way to be like, you know, we're doing the same things ish, and I want to honor the people who aren't here, and that felt meaningful to her.
Absolutely. And I think just knowing that you can come up with their creative ideas and have conversations with the people who are going to be part of your holiday to just say, what might we want to do to acknowledge the people who aren't going to be here? And we can have a
Mm-hmm.
conversation. We can plan in advance to try to figure out what are some things that might meet everybody's needs. There is lots of wonderful and creative ways to do that.
Yeah. I think you're kind of leaning into the next part that I'm really curious about is like for someone listening who has experienced a recent loss, how do you recommend someone start preparing themselves for their grief during the holidays, and how can we communicate that with others, especially if like both of us have lost someone and what we might need may be different in that situation?
Yeah, I think the first thing to do is just to really get comfortable with the idea that like the hard moments are going to come up. Like there's going to be these hard times, and that doesn't mean that you're failing at the holidays. That means that
Mm-hmm.
you're grieving through them. And oftentimes what can happen is when difficult feelings come up, we feel like we have to be like, oh no, I have to push this away, because I have to put on a strong face for everyone, or try to use this opportunity to be really happy and joyful. And instead, of course, just going, we can hold both. And so when these
Mm-hmm.
things come up, I'm just going to open myself to whatever is coming up for me, all of the emotions. And in thinking about my holidays, I'm going to sort of build that in. So we suggest to people all the time just little stuff like be thoughtful about driving yourself places if you worry that you might get trapped because you got a
Mm-hmm.
ride with other people who aren't ready to leave, and you're just like, this is too much. I've had this space that works for me, but now I really need to go
Mm-hmm.
back and restore myself at home with some
Mm-hmm.
time on my own with my grief. Having that there, talking to people about that. If you're nervous about committing to events, saying that to people up front, just saying, this has been a really hard year. There's been so much loss. I'm feeling kind of hesitant about committing to things. My plan right now is I'm going to come and maybe stay for an hour, but I might have to leave even sooner than that. And
Mm-hmm.
I want to try to come, but we'll see how it goes. To kind of just give yourself permission to go to things for a little while and leave, skip things
Mm-hmm.
if you need to, not feel that guilt if you realize you committed to something and now you've changed your mind, to feel comfortable having an honest conversation with someone and just saying, I said yes because I really wanted to be able to do this. And unfortunately, I just have to take care of myself and my grief, and I don't have it in me right now.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully knowing that the people around you who love you and care about you are not going to want you to overextend yourself or push yourself out of some sense of obligation. So if you can be honest, it's hard, especially if you're somebody who struggles with the idea of canceling on someone or not showing up for the whole thing and being full on happy. But it's a good place to practice and to just be honest about how you're feeling in advance. And on the other side, to give yourself permission to like go and have a great time. Sometimes
Yeah.
we feel guilty, like, God, this is the first year that I'm going to go to this New Year's party without my husband. And like, I can't believe I'm going. It feels wrong. I'm supposed to be grieving, with this
Mm-hmm.
misconception that what we do is we somehow like grieve 100% of the time. And then we're always oscillating back and forth between the painful emotions of grief and then just surviving and living and figuring out how to thrive and grow in the world again. And those things are always going to be there together. And that means that we need to be able to give ourselves permission to get breaks, to enjoy the joy when it comes, to find connection and release and community and all the things that can be part of the holiday season. And so I think giving yourself permission to find that and to not think that that's a betrayal to their memory or that means you're forgetting or moving on or letting
Mm-hmm.
go, that is, our connection is in so much more than our pain. There are all these other things that connect us. And so being able to recognize that we can enjoy the holidays
Mm-hmm.
is another thing we always suggest to people. The last one I'll say, which is a little more abstract, but I think can be helpful, is just, to really kind of ground in for yourself about what sort of the values of the holiday season that are important to you, and knowing that we can sometimes have the way we spend our holiday shift in a lot of ways and still stay connected to the values that are important to us. So if you feel like certain holidays are about family or about gratitude or giving or service or whatever it is, like thinking about what is so important about these days to you, not just in kind of the what and the how, but like the why behind the
Mm-hmm.
holiday that makes it meaningful for you, and identifying that and thinking about that and thinking about it may be connected to your loved one too, and like what did they love and value about the holiday that was important to them, and then saying, how am I going to do that this year? Like, what feels right? It might be different, the way we connect with friends or family, the way that we practice gratitude or service or whatever else might be part of that day for us. We might say, this year I'm doing it differently, and maybe I'm not like hopping off to a tropical island.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you are, and that's okay too. But maybe I'm doing something totally different, but that still feels connected with my values and the
Mm-hmm.
value of that holiday. And so I'm able to still feel that connection, even though maybe I really do change what the tradition looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I so appreciate so many parts of what you just said. And I think just like first naming how you talked about like allowing yourself to feel joy during a holiday when you're grieving, I think it's a really interesting parallel how um, we need to lean into that wholeness. Like the wholeness of the holidays can be really hard. And there's like, it doesn't have to be happy and the most wonderful time of the year. And the flip side of like grief can have a lot of joy and beauty in it too. And you don't have to feel super sad all the time to show that you so deeply cared for that loved one or continue that connection. I see my grandmother dealing with this a lot right now. It's like she can't allow herself to feel joyful because she feels like it's a betrayal, when in fact, like, it's not any less love, and that person who's gone wants you to feel joy. So maybe if you do feel joy, it's like a way of connecting with them through that gift they're holding space for you to have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Just really mirroring like the wholeness and the wide range of emotions that the holidays hold, that grief holds, that this human experience holds. And when you're talking about preparing for the holidays, I kind of like to think a lot about these like 3 pillars kind of help me move through everything. And as I was listening to you talk, I was like, yes, I feel like this is it. And like awareness of like, how are you feeling? Like, what is actually here for you? What expectations do you have for yourself? What expectations do others have for you? What ones are projected? And awareness of like, what are your values? Like really getting clear on those things before you move into the holiday season. And then really leaning to that acceptance. Accepting the joy you might feel, accepting the pain you might feel, accepting like walking into a party and having to walk out of the door, like holding space for whatever is there to be there, because the reality is like, whether you like it or not, it already is. Like,
Yes.
whatever you think it should be doesn't matter, because what is what's here. So you can release a lot of suffering if you release the resistance around it and just like accept what's there.
Yeah.
And then really just like, I just feel like drenching yourself in compassion for like whatever you're feeling, like holding that wide range of experiences you might be feeling with so much compassion. I think of like steeping yourself in like a pot of compassion tea, like your little tea bag just getting steeped in it. And I think compassion requires a lot of action. So coming up with like an action plan for yourself of like, okay, I'm going to communicate to this person who I know will be at this party that like I might need to leave and I'm not going to be able to say goodbye to everyone, and I need you to just kind of like have my back on that. Or if I am going to go to this thing, here's what I need to do before, here's what I need to do during, and here's what I need to do after to like nourish and reset and tend to myself to make it through this wave. And those are just some things I try to always apply to the holidays, period, like, because it's just such a whelming time of year. And just having tools like that can make all the difference.
No, I think that you're spot on. And that compassion, I love how Kristen Neff, who's a self-compassion researcher, she talks about the idea that we need to have tender self-compassion and fierce self-compassion. And tender self-compassion, she says it's that self-kindness and mindfulness and our awareness of our kind of universal humanity that happens, and we need to just be gentle and allow ourselves to take it easy and to give ourselves permission to leave early and cancel and all those things. But she also talks about fierce self-compassion in saying like sometimes we need to give ourselves a little like kick in the butt to have boundaries, or to get ourselves actually to push ourselves. Like maybe it is that last year you really were in that tender self-compassion place and you were like, I am not gonna do anything out of any sense of obligation or go anywhere. I'm just gonna cocoon at home. And that really like worked. But maybe you did feel a sense of loss, that you kind of missed out on connecting with people and feeling a sense of family or community. And now you're in that kind of, what do I do, middle ground space. And one of the things she says is sometimes the way that we practice fierce self-compassion is by figuring out how to push ourselves to do something even when it isn't easy. And that can be its own kind of self-compassion. And I think that can be really helpful to remember in grief in general, but especially at the holidays, because often we think I need to feel motivated in order to do something. Like I need to like feel that. And the reality is there are many moments in life where we're not motivated to do things that are really important to us and that we really
Mm-hmm.
value and that we really want to do. And there's an important place that we can find like that middle ground, I think, sometimes at the holidays when we do tap into certain values or certain things maybe that we did decide to tap out of last year, and we're on the fence about what we want to do this year, to say, you know what, I might not feel motivated and I can still decide to try. I can
Mm-hmm.
still decide to like push myself to show up. And maybe I bail and I leave and
Mm-hmm.
I say never mind. But that we can find that place. And sometimes what happens is that that motion starts to kind of give us an energy that allows us to actually feel more engaged once we're doing it. It's like that analogy of a car, if you it breaks down and you have to push it off the road, like that
Mm-hmm.
first inch is impossible, but once you get it moving, it starts rolling.
Mm-hmm.
And that can sometimes happen, and I think that can be an important piece at the holidays too, to just think of those different types of compassion that we might show ourselves that allow us to move in either direction, like the let me just like
Mm-hmm.
cocoon and take care of myself and bail when I need to, and also let me connect with my values and figure out how to maybe give myself that little push if I need to.
Mm-hmm. I think you're just so spot on with all of that, because so much, we often will resist something that feels uncomfortable, but really discomfort is just something that's unfamiliar. So if
Absolutely.
like we, and kind of that concept of like objects in motion stay in motion. If you like look at Chinese medicine, it's all about where we're finding like blockages, and that causes so much disease and illness in the body and energetically. And we also live in a society where we're so forced in the go, 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 the do, do, do. It's like a weird balance game. And it can be hard to discern between like, when do I need to push myself and when do I need to rest? And I think you just nailed it on the head right there with like, if you sit with your values first, if you bring your awareness to like what you value, what's really happening right now, then you are better able to discern like right now, fierce self-compassion looks like, putting on my boots, walking out the door, walking into that space full of people. And sometimes fierce self-compassion looks like picking up the phone, setting a boundary, and getting under the blanket. And
Absolutely.
only you know what is truly right for you. But don't be afraid if things feel uncomfortable or unfamiliar. Discomfort isn't a bad thing. Um, and it's okay to hold space for some of that during the holiday season too.
Oh, it's like an imperative, I think, in all of grief is to remember that grief is this process of learning to live in
Mm,
a world that is completely different than the world you've ever lived in. It's a world where
yeah.
this person is missing, where you're feeling things you never felt, where you're doing things with those feelings in a way
Mm-hmm.
that often brings up discomfort, right? We like have this idea of, if I feel these emotions like sadness and despair and overwhelm and all of these things, and I've never thought about or tried to feel those things in a space that otherwise feels like it's supposed to be about joy and happiness, of course we're going to feel discomfort. Like that is a
Mm-hmm.
really dissonant experience, and when we've never done it before, it is so challenging. It's so challenging to
Mm-hmm.
go, how do I hold so many feelings and so many experiences at once? And there is, exactly as you said, there's no right or wrong, only you know what is going to feel best for you and when you need to be cocooned at home under the blanket, and when maybe you need to go, okay, of course I'm feeling discomfort, I'm learning, like grief is
Mm-hmm.
learning, I'm learning to live in the world differently now, and sometimes it's going to feel uncomfortable.
Yes. Litsa, thank you so much for holding space to share how we can be with one of the hardest things during the fullest time of the year. I so appreciate your time. And for those listening, how can people stay connected with you and your work? How can they connect with you for grief support? I know you just have so many incredible resources out there for people.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Our website is whatsyourgrief.com. We have tons of information about grief and the holidays and getting through the holiday season, and
I'll
very
have it all linked
practical.
in the show notes.
Yeah, lots of information there. And we have a podcast also called What's Your Grief? We have a book also called What's Your Grief?
Love
List
that
to help
book.
you through any loss. And for people who are looking for a little more support than just those things, we also have a member community where people can join, and we have a forum and befriending grief sessions and grief cafes and community writing and workshops and webinars and all sorts of things like that for people who are looking for more. And we really focus on the idea that for some people, connecting and talking, that really helps in their grief. And for some people, like doing things on their own and processing individually and learning and creating and all of those things are what's helpful for grief. So it's a space that's really for all types of grievers to be able to find what works and tap into their own kind of grief expression.
Thank you so much for the work that you do and holding this space for so many people. I know it's so needed, and I so appreciate you, and I know so many listeners do too.
Yeah, I appreciate you so much kind of bringing this to the surface during the holiday season. It doesn't get talked about enough, and I know people sometimes feel a lot of confusion and shame, so I appreciate you so much raising this.
Thank you for taking time to listen to the wise one inside of you today. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast to help it grow. Until the next time, let's keep taking it one breath at a time.